Good. Well, I hope you can hear me. I'll just check with my colleagues if you can all hear me. Gavin, Philip, Denise.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Excellent. Very good. Very good. Thank you. Excellent. Well, I think it's just 1:30 UK time, so I think we'll make a start. And may I say welcome to you all to our webinar on the role of parliaments in times of crisis. And it's wonderful to see that people are joining from the Caribbean, from Europe, from Africa, from Asia. Many different countries signed up and have joined or we hope are joining. So welcome to you all. I hope you're all keeping safe and well. My name is Claire Cameron, and I'm one of the directors at PAI. That's Public Administration International, and some of you will know, if you're familiar with us, that we're a London-based international consultancy and development organisation. We specialise in strengthening governance worldwide. So I'm delighted that our two of our experts, Professor Gavin Drury and Dr. Philip Aylett, are with us today to talk to us about the role of parliaments in the 21st century. And in particular, the UK case, looking at the constitutional impacts of two major things, COVID and Brexit, and some of the impacts that both of those issues are having on the role and the status and operational procedures in Parliament. You can see, I think, from the slide, which I hope you can all see, a short description of Gavin and of Philip. Both are members of our advisory panel and both key contributors to a workshop that we normally run face-to-face in London each year on parliamentary administration. We'll say a little bit more about the workshops towards the end of the presentation. So I'm going to hand, I hope, to my colleague Denise now to talk us through the software and how to engage really with us in terms of chat and questions and some polls that we've organised, and then we'll hand to Gavin and after that to Philip, and then probably back to me at the end. But thanks again for joining us, and please do. We're looking forward to your participation. So please do ask questions and make comments in the chat box. So over to you, I think now, please, Denise. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and as Claire says, welcome to our webinar this afternoon. I just want to talk with you a little bit about the how to communicate with us during the webinar. Unfortunately, we will have your microphones muted, but there is a chat room that you can use throughout the webinar. And I noticed that some of you have actually already been posting in there, and we would really welcome you talking in the chat room, introducing yourself, with your organisation and country maybe, so that we can see who's actually joined, and maybe comment on the presentation as it goes along. You will see also there is a question box, and if you have any questions that you would like to give to the experts, please write them in here, and at the end of the webinar we will come back to you and discuss as many of them as possible. As Claire said, during the webinar I will be launching some polls, and I will show you the answers towards the end. So please, I do ask, once the polls are launched, please do give your answers so that we can all see your views. So now I will hand over to Gavin. And as I said at the beginning, if you have any questions, please do log them within the chat room. Thank you. I hope you find the webinar very interesting and useful.
Denise, one more thing. Sorry, Denise. I just remembered that, of course, we will be sending a copy of the presentation slides out after the session, And I think we're recording the session, so if by any chance you have technical problems, then all is not lost. We should be able to get you all the recording if necessary. But let's hope that doesn't happen. So thanks very much. Okay, thank you. Over to you, Gavin.
Thank you very much, Claire. And thank you, Denise, for those sort of technical issues, which are so important on these occasions. We're very much in the hands of technology. I experienced a power cut last evening, and I was in dread that it might recur this afternoon, which would have caused no end of problems. So, welcome everyone to this webinar. Thank you all for signing up. I look forward very much to working with you. I'm afraid these kind of presentations, these online presentations, tend, if one's perfectly honest about it, to be a bit of a one-way street, not of our choosing. It's a situational thing. Normally, we would be having the cut and thrust of debate. We can do some of that, and I hope we will, through the chat box. But alas, well, you can see and hear me, but I can't see or hear you. So the opportunities for dialogue are a bit more limited than they normally would be. So you have the title of the webinar on your screen, and what does the title actually mean in terms of the theme? Well, what we're looking at today is how major national crises impact upon parliamentary government, really in two senses. First of all, the effect on the constitutional position of parliaments in the handling of crises, vis-a-vis government, and to some extent vis-a-vis the courts as well. And secondly, the impact on the actual conduct of business in parliamentary institutions in the midst of major crises. And the latter is very much going to be Philip's domain rather than mine. The former will be more my territory. And we are going principally to be looking at the impact of crisis by way of an illustration of two big critical events in the UK, which are still ongoing. And we will be using those for illustrative purposes. But as I say on the slide, we also would like as much feedback from you as is possible about your local and regional experiences via the chat box. And the two crises that I referred to just now are, first of all, Brexit. Brexit, the momentous decision to withdraw from membership of the European Union following a UK national referendum that was held in June 2016, which voted narrowly in favour of withdrawal from the Union, a union that we'd been part of for nearly 50 years. The second one is less sort of local and regional, but global, and that is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has been a crisis in one way or another, and to a greater or lesser extent in every country in the world, I think. So we're going to do it in two parts. I'm going to do the first part on the constitutional impact, and the second part is going to be undertaken by my colleague, Dr. Philip Aylett, who, unlike me, I'm an academic, actually is an insider to the parliamentary process as a senior and experienced parliamentary clerk. So hopefully our two perspectives will not overlap too much, and hopefully they will complement one another. Let's wait and see. Let me begin with a slightly tongue-in-cheek picture gallery. The three portraits that you see there are of people who, in one way or another, impinge directly or indirectly on our agenda today. And I will return briefly to these people as we go along. The image in the bottom right-hand corner of the gallery, I'm afraid, doesn't need any introduction. It is the horrible COVID-19 virus, which is dominating so many aspects of our lives at the moment. I won't be repeating this horrible picture, but it will be lurking in the background of some of what we're going to say about crisis. Now, let me begin by saying something about the main aspects of parliamentary government in the UK. Some of this you may know already, so I won't go into too much detail, and I will try to deal with this fairly quickly. One thing I will say before leaving this slide is note the plural S after Parliament and systems. We will, as we will see in a moment, be talking mainly about the UK Parliament, but there are other parliamentary institutions in the UK as well that mustn't be forgotten. Starting with the House of Commons, the Westminster House of Commons, we have 650 members of Parliament. There is currently a Conservative government which has an overall majority in the House of Commons of 80 seats. That's to say 80 seats more than all the other political parties put together. And that's a heck of a big majority. However, between the general elections that were held in June 2018 and the most recent one in December 2019, there was a hung parliament, a parliament in which no political party had a working majority. And the result of this, as can often be the case with hung parliaments, is a deadlocked situation, a situation of continuing disagreement, particularly over what to do about the Brexit settlement, what kind of deal we should be aiming for with the European Union in the aftermath of our leaving it. In the Speaker's chair during this difficult period was John Bercow. I will move the slide down. There he is. You might have seen him on your television screens. He became a little bit of a celebrity, not just nationally, but I think in some overseas non-UK countries as well. And there he is in typical pose, uttering some major pronouncement to the House of Commons. And John Bercow tried reinterpreting, I'm using a polite word, some would say bending, procedural rules to try and break out of this deadlock. But I was going to say, alas, maybe it was a good thing he didn't. He was ultimately unsuccessful, and all his imaginative reinterpretations came to naught. Parliament remained deadlocked, and a crisis arose, which is part of what I'm going to be talking about later on. There we go, past John Bercow. To revisit a point I made just now, a reminder that we aren't just talking about one single parliamentary institution based in London. And we're not just talking about London, and we're not just talking about England, because the United Kingdom comprises 4 distinct countries, all with their own histories and traditions. England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, which between them only make up 20% of the population of the UK, each have their own elected parliaments and executives exercising powers that have been devolved to them by statutes passed by the Westminster Parliament. So they are creatures of UK statutes, and that is in essence what the term devolution means. England has 80% of the population. It has 533 of the 650 MPs, but there is no separate English Parliament. Sometimes the Westminster Parliament looks a bit English because of those overwhelming numbers of MPs from English constituencies. But there is no separate English Parliament. It's a UK Parliament. But in England, there are big municipal local authorities in the major conurbations, particularly London, but also Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham. And these conurbations, these municipal local authorities, have elected mayors who are quite big political figures in their city conurbation regions. Devolved functions that have been devolved to the non-English parliaments and governments, are important areas of domestic policy, including education, health, policing, and social care, all of which are important, particularly in the context of managing the COVID crisis. And I'll be saying a little bit about that later, and Philip will be saying a lot more later on. Most of the subnational parliament, well, all the subnational parliaments and the English municipal authorities as well, are controlled by political parties that are different from the Conservative government in London. Scotland and Northern Ireland voted against Brexit in the 2016 referendum. England and Wales voted in favour. So one issue that has arisen in the handling of Brexit and the COVID crisis has been this political fragmentation. It's been difficult very often to achieve across UK political consensus on these two critical issues. There have been major areas of contention and of divergence. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that devolution, the granting of statutory powers to devolved subnational authorities, isn't the same as federalism. Though we sometimes look a little bit like a federal country, we aren't. We're a unitary state. Now, I've used a word, constitution, and in the context of saying that the UK is a unitary state, I've put on slide the word constitutionally. But what on earth do we mean by constitutionally, given that the UK has notoriously and pretty well uniquely not got a codified constitution? All your countries have, and ours doesn't. Now, some of our constitution is actually written down in law. There are important acts of parliament that clearly have a constitutional subject matter and status. The devolution legislation that granted independent or semi-independent or autonomous functions to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. These are constitutional statutes, and ditto the statutes relating to our membership of the European Union and with our withdrawal from the Union. So a lot of it is written down, but most of it isn't. And a lot of constitutional rules are based upon uncodified conventions. And similarly, a lot of parliamentary procedure is, although some of it is in the standing orders of the two houses of parliament, is similarly based upon conventions. What are these conventions? Well, they've sometimes been likened to mutually acknowledged understandings between the key actors in the processes of government about how things should be done. And for the most part, that works remarkably smoothly. more smoothly than one might expect. So conventions on the face of it are quite a nice sort of set of agreements about how things should be done, which is all very well, but as the commentator Sidney Lowe, writing in a book called The Governance of England at the beginning of the 20th century, said of conventions, we live under a system of tacit understandings, but the understandings themselves are not always understood. And recent events in the UK have revealed just how true this is. They've revealed some of the uncertainties that can arise when the limitations of uncodified understandings are tested by crises such as the Brexit controversies and COVID-19. For the most part, conventions work pretty well, but when they're put to the test in difficult and controversial circumstances, sometimes their limitations are exposed. Now, let me say a few words about the relationship between the executive and Parliament in our constitutional setup. The UK system, as many of you will already know, is based on a fusion of executive and legislative functions. The Prime Minister and his or her ministers, cabinet ministers and more junior ministers, are themselves members of Parliament. Most of them nowadays sit in the elected House of Commons, and democratic government requires that this is so. It used to be the case in a less democratic era, as recently as the 19th century, that a lot of key positions, including indeed the Prime Minister's position, was held by somebody sitting in the non-elected House of Lords. But in the modern era, that would no longer be appropriate. But there do have to be some government ministers, sometimes quite important ministers in the House of Lords, to make sure that government business is handled there properly. In our Parliament, it's governments who initiate policy and all significant legislation. And most of the parliamentary timetable is allocated to government business. And if, as is the case now, the government of the day has a large Commons majority, government business, thanks to enforcement through strict party discipline, is almost guaranteed to pass. And prime ministers, particularly in circumstances where they have big majorities, have sometimes been accused of behaving rather like presidents, rather like the President of the United States, for example, who operates in a system of separation of powers rather than fusion of powers. Now, is this accusation, if it is an accusation, of prime ministers becoming and behaving more like presidents, is it fair and accurate? I used to set my students exam questions very much to that effect. Well, the answer, as with so many questions, is no and maybe yes. On the no side, the Prime Minister can't be a president because we already have a head of state. The Prime Minister is head of government, but not, unlike the US president, head of state. The Queen is our head of state. And secondly, the Prime Minister is not directly elected. The Prime Minister emerges through parliamentary elections and is the person who is the head or the leader of the majority parliament party in the House of Commons. So that's the no's. But on the yes side of the balance sheet, prime ministers, particularly ones with large majorities, strut about with a high profile on the international as well as the national stage alongside heads of state and presidential figures. So they look a bit like presidents, and sometimes behave a bit as though they are. And so far as their relationship with Parliament is concerned, they sometimes, some are more guilty of this than others, find parliamentary accountability and scrutiny a bit of a nuisance rather than a positive democratic principle. And in the end, I suppose it all boils down to the personalities of prime ministers. Some are a bit more self-effacing than others. You never get to be prime minister at all if you're completely self-effacing, but this is a relative thing. So some prime ministers are sort of more, shall we say, assertive of a presidential position, presidential image than others. And lurking in the background is what I've said earlier about the uncodified constitution. It's easier for prime ministers to behave like presidents when they are less constrained by a constitution which is uncodified and based upon sometimes rather elastic conventions. Now, parliamentary scrutiny. And I've used the word urgent in the heading of this slide because urgency is a characteristic of crisis, urgent resolution of very difficult problems. There's an old saying, a week is a long time in politics, and governments are always in a hurry to do things. And sometimes parliamentary debate and scrutiny gets in their way. Yes, governments always pay lip service to the idea that parliamentary debate and scrutiny are important aspects of democracy. They may even improve policies sometimes, but they also slow things down in a way that prime ministers and ministers in a hurry find rather irksome. And a crisis where things are particularly urgent can give political leaders good excuses for bypassing Parliament, for sidestepping parliamentary scrutiny if they can get away with it. And of course, the absence of constitutional constraint can make this easier. And a lot of aspects of the Brexit saga and the Johnson government's handling of the COVID-19 crisis provide illustrations of this. And there's one other thing to say before I sign off on this slide, and that is we've moved into an era of what is commonly called populism, populist politics, in which social media and referendums have started to play a part. And former President Trump's tweets are a particularly egregious example of this. And once you move into a populist way of doing politics, in which prime ministers and presidents can reach over the head of parliaments and the mainstream media to their own supporters out there in the country, then you are perhaps further encouraging the development of presidential style ambitions. Now, Brexit. And I'm going to bring another set of actors into play here, the courts, because two big illustrations of the Brexit crisis involving Parliament and the courts arose, which, although they don't by any means tell the whole story, tell an important part of it. And these are the so-called Miller cases. Why are they called the Miller cases? Well, the answer lies in this lady, Gina Miller. Gina Miller is a very formidable and successful businesswoman who was opposed to the Brexit process, but was also, and perhaps more importantly, particularly keen to make sure that if Brexit is going to happen, then Parliament has a proper voice in the process of extricating ourselves from the European Union. And the first case in which Gina Miller was a litigant and for lawyers among you, the citation details are there. This was a case that arose soon after the 2016 referendum, and it arose from the fact that the government of the day, then headed by Theresa May, wanted to launch the Brexit process by executive fiat using the royal prerogative. And a lot of critics said, hang on a minute, what about Parliament? Surely Parliament should be given a voice in something as momentous as this. And that was certainly Gina Miller's view. Litigation was brought by her and some associates in the High Court, and the High Court reached a decision that was later upheld by the UK Supreme Court, that Parliament did indeed have a necessary voice in the Brexit process, and that the government couldn't simply rule on it or make the decision by executive decree. There had to be parliamentary confirmation. That caused a great deal of dispute on the part of those who were in a hurry to get on with Brexit, but it was a reaffirmation of Parliament's role and parliamentary sovereignty in the context of the Brexit process. Sorry, I've pressed the wrong button. The second Miller case arose 2 or 3 years later, much more recently, as the process of negotiating the exit from the European Union began to take shape, or indeed failed to take shape, because, as you will remember, there was for a long time a hung parliament, which was deadlocked. And by now the Prime Minister was Boris Johnson, and Boris Johnson got impatient with Parliament's inability to decide what sort of Brexit it wanted, and he decided to take draconian action. And his answer to the deadlock was to use his prime ministerial power to advise the Queen to prorogue, that is to say, suspend Parliament for several weeks in order to forestall further foot dragging, as he saw it, by a deadlocked Parliament. Hang on a minute, a lot of people were extremely outraged by this. Even some people who favoured Brexit thought this was going a bit far. And Gina Miller brought a case in the UK courts. Parallel litigation was launched by others in the Scottish courts. And the case eventually ended up in the UK Supreme Court. And the UK Supreme Court held unanimously that the UK government had acted in bad faith. This was not a legitimate use of the prerogative power to prorogue Parliament, and was in violation of fundamental constitutional principles. Even in a unwritten constitution, there are principles that must be observed, and the Supreme Court ruled that Parliament must be reconvened forthwith, which it duly was. So here we have the courts playing an important role in reaffirming the sovereign principles to do with parliamentary government. Now, who's this? Oh, well, now here we have somebody, goes back even before my time, indeed to the 16th century. This is the Tudor king, Henry VIII, famous for many things, but one of the things he was famous for was legislating by decree. He was a very autocratic king, and he made no secret of the fact that what he expected what he said to be treated as legally binding. And I'll come back to him in a minute, because we're now into an area which Philip is going to talk about in much more detail in his half of the presentation. This is delegated legislation. Both the COVID-19 crisis and the Brexit withdrawal from the European Union were effected through primary legislation, through Acts of Parliament. And the two main Acts of Parliament that we're talking about here are on your screen. The Coronavirus Act of 2020 and the European Union Future Relationship Act, also of 2020, and in fact very recent. And both these acts make extensive provision for the making of ministerial regulations which are subject to limited parliamentary scrutiny and offer virtually no possibility of amendment or repeal by Parliament. And there is one aspect of delegated legislation which is particularly controversial, and that is the so-called Henry VIII clauses, hence my reference to that famous king, which allow primary legislation itself to be amended by secondary legislation. And we will see an example of this in a moment. Delegated legislation. But before I come back to that, let me just look again. I've looked a little bit about Brexit in relation to those two Miller cases. Let me say something about the COVID crisis. And COVID, as you will know, is something that moves very horribly quickly. And dealing with it is a matter of great urgency. Scientific and medical evidence is constantly evolving and changing, and you need rapid action. And it's always a great challenge for governments to keep up with these rapidly changing events, and it's a huge challenge for Parliament to keep up with a government trying to keep up. Primary legislation, and the primary legislation I've been talking about in the COVID and Brexit context, confers extensive emergency powers, not just on ministers in the case of COVID, but also on other public bodies, on local authorities, on National Health Service authorities, regulatory bodies, and so on. And another thing to bear in mind about COVID is not only does it move quickly, but it also has a rapidly changing and differential impact geographically and socially. Some areas and some subcategories of the population are hit by it harder than others. And so once you realize how unevenly distributed the impact of COVID is, you run up against difficulties to do with different treatment, different ways of tackling the problem in different parts of the country. A lot of COVID-related issues fall within the jurisdiction of local government and the devolved administration in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, which, as you will remember, are controlled by different political parties, and they're answerable to their own electorates, and they move at different speeds and have different priorities. All governments have a challenge, a major challenge. This is true of your governments as well as ours, and that's how to steer a course between maintaining public health and maintaining the health of the economy. Once you start taking tough measures, this involves locking businesses down, putting people out of work, either permanently or temporarily. There are huge economic impacts, and governments have to try and balance the two. And our government has tried to meet that challenge, and it has had to try to do so against the backdrop of different parts of the country moving at a different speed and with different political agendas. And in Parliament itself, looking back over the last few months, it seems that our Prime Minister has been sometimes more influenced by his own party's backbenchers than by Parliament itself, making sure that his majority isn't eroded by disputes on his own backbenches. He can ignore a lot of opposition criticism because he has such an overwhelming landslide majority. There's that Act of Parliament I spoke about earlier, the front cover of the European Union Future Relationships Act of 2020. The background to that legislation was 4.5 years of very, very difficult negotiations with the European Union under two UK Prime Ministers, Theresa May and then Boris Johnson. The final deadline for reaching an agreement and putting it into law as between the UK and the European Union was the 31st of December last year, just a few weeks ago. And things dragged on and on and on. I won't go into the details. I can barely remember the details because there were so many of them. And eventually, surprise, surprise, a trade and cooperation agreement was announced on the 24th of December, Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve just gone. And it was a massive, great document. 1,256 pages of text, plus annexes, about 2,000 pages in total. And this had to be agreed by Parliament before the 31st of December. And Parliament was recalled on the 30th of December. The bill, the European Union Future Relationship Bill, which itself was 87 pages of text, passed all its stages in both houses of Parliament in 14 hours before getting the royal assent. And there was a suspicion, and I won't pretend that I dissent from it, that this was a case of the Prime Minister and his government having run down the clock to the very last minute to limit parliamentary scrutiny, which might have thrown up all sorts of pitfalls and difficulties. And the legislation, looking to the here and now after the Act was passed just before the end of last year, there is extensive provision for delegated legislation. And here's a slide that makes that clear. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, you'll be glad to hear. I'll read just the beginning of it and then a little tiny bit more. A relevant national authority may by regulations make such provision as the relevant national authority considers appropriate, to implement the trade and cooperation agreement, blah, blah, blah. And then subsection 2 of section 31 says regulations under this section may make any provision that could be made by an act of Parliament, including modifying this act. And the ghost of Henry VIII stirs happily at this point, because that is a classic Henry VIII clause. Over to Philip in a minute, but let me first of all go over to Denise, who is going to administer the polling question, and I will come back to you at the end. Denise?
Hello there. So I just launched the poll questions, and I can see that we've had just a couple of responses now. Gavin, do you want me to show the responses in just a moment, or wait until the end?
Wait until the end, please, Denise, because people may want to think about it a little bit and ponder upon it even while Philip is speaking, although it's unimaginable that anyone would want to think of anything else but Philip while he is speaking.
Okay. All right, then. So people are voting now. Hello, Philip. Can you hear me? Yes.
Take over.
Yeah. So it's over to you now. We can see you, and I think you can move the slides forward yourself.
Yes, thank you. Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening. I'm Philip Bayliss. I'm one of the clerks of the International Development Committee in the House of Commons, and I am going to talk to you about the adaptations that Parliament has had to make in the UK to this crisis that's been described by Gavin just now. I'll talk in a little bit detail about how Parliament has adapted to the twin challenges of Brexit and the coronavirus pandemic. First, on terms of the changes to procedure to ensure safety, which are quite significant and have quite a big impact. Second, a bit more about responding to the legislative and scrutiny demands of the twin simultaneous pinch points, which have came to a head right at the end of 2020, that have been developing through the year, which is the Brexit completion, which you just heard about, and the emergence in December of the British COVID-19 strain, which has now become famous across the world. And third, I want to sort of note anyway that devolved administrations, as you've been hearing, have become relatively more important, and Westminster to a certain extent less so in those countries. I would say that changes to devolved procedures have been similar, but the impact of government leaders in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland has put them in some ways on a similar footing to the UK Prime Minister. This is partly because of the nature of the devolution. A lot of the issues that are of interest or that come into the purview of the Welsh Senedd, the Scots Parliament and the Northern Ireland Assembly are to do with health, schooling, agriculture, various things of great importance, and particularly health. And the performance and presentation of those leaders in those devolved areas have become very important and have put them on, as I said, on a similar footing to the United Kingdom Prime Minister. So let's have a look at what the Commons chamber looked like until about a year ago. Here we have it. We have opposition on the right-hand side and the government on the left-hand side in this case, the speaker in the middle. The paucity of people on the right-hand side, I think, is to do with the fact this was a photograph was taken during a coalition government we had in 2010, 2015, when there were a heck of a lot of people in government and there were not so many people in opposition. The Liberal Democrats joined with the Conservatives, which is why there's so much crowding on the government benches. So what you see, it's a clear divide. Government and opposition face each other. There are a lot of people shouting, booing. It's too small for the membership of 650, so there's a crowded feeling to it. There's plenty of standing to try and attract the attention of the speaker. Not everyone was happy with Speaker Bercow, as you probably realised. Waving of order papers, it's very much a performance place, and it had a lot of tension, a lot of stress that went on. But the chamber had to make changes. They introduced social distancing measures in the chamber to meet public health guidelines, a limit of 50 MPs in the chamber, which I think is still the same. A big change was the production of caller lists. Before this, in normal times, the speaker picks people to speak next. He tends to speak to have obviously the government side and then the opposition side, then the government side again. But he would tend to his eye would have to be caught by the member. So people would jump up and try and catch the eye of the speaker to try and make a speech. Now there are call lists which are published in advance to manage attendance in the chamber. Some MPs like the idea of call list. This is a list of MPs and the order in which they're speaking. It's a bit more ordered than catching the speaker's eye. Remote participation is available to those MPs who need it. In some cases, MPs are older or vulnerable in various ways, and therefore they want to keep away from the House of Commons and prevent themselves getting COVID. But this was a way of ensuring that participation was going on. There are new ways of voting, including an extension of the proxy voting scheme as well. New ways of voting more electronically using cards and various other things. So bringing things up to date in some respects, but the effect in the chamber is very different. And here we have a chamber post-COVID, a different sort of politics altogether. People 2 to 3 meters apart. On the front bench there, you just see one of the whips, one of the managers of the House, talking to Boris Johnson, risking a little bit, obviously leaning over a little bit too far, keeping within the 2 meters distance. But the whole feel of the place is very different. Here we have the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer, and the Speaker. But the feel of the place is very different. And the Prime Minister has to look up. He has, sometimes he has a question from one of the members who are on the screens up here. Very different flavour to it. The culture has changed. There's a lack of noise in the chamber, relatively. It favours forensic scrutiny over impassioned oratory. There is no rabble to rouse. It has been said that this helps the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer, because he is a very experienced lawyer. And when he puts questions to the Prime Minister in Prime Minister's Question Time, there isn't he can work him as he would be a witness working a witness in a courtroom, and it suits him. And the detailed scrutiny suits Starmer's view approach rather than Mr. Johnson's approach. Mr. Johnson is a great wordsmith and very good at the rhetoric, and he is able to to capture the mood very well. But when there is no rabble to rouse, no mood, no large group of Conservative MPs in there, he has a bit of difficulty. The older members need to isolate, as I said, but there's also been a massive reduction in informal contact in corridors, and tea rooms and bars. That contact is lost, so things have to be debated in a more formal manner, and people have to use Zoom to get in touch with each other. So the House itself has lost quite a lot in terms of informal contact, which is the sort of thing which is useful when you're trying to get the mood of the House. So politicians trying to read the mood of the House find it more difficult. I'm told members feel much more alone, because they'll lose out in 2 ways. They can't come to the House of Commons to meet their friends in their own parties and others. Neither can they see as many people in constituencies. Instead, people become keyboard warriors. I think you know the term. It means that people are sometimes obsessive and keep sending the same message to people over the internet. And this has really made people more solitary, and female members particularly have become target of much abuse over the years anyway, and this is now exacerbated in this particularly strange time. Committees have changed too. This is a committee of the House of Commons. This is the Exiting the European Union Committee. Fairly typical layout. We have 11 or 12 members round here. They are often mixed. They don't sit necessarily in party groups. So you might have Labour members here mixed with Conservative members. They don't go in groups. So there's just a fairly good mixing, a good spirit. The witnesses are here. The chair is here. The clerk is here. Fairly standard approach, and you may know that from your own legislatures. Changed a bit since then. This is the much more bitty experience of the COVID era committee, with 1 or 2 members up here sitting in a committee room, but others, including the chairman, sitting in their own houses. Very different flavour, a very, very different flavour. And here is the minister down here sitting very comfortably in his office in the cabinet office, and being but a very different flavour to the whole of Parliament. I'm sure you've had the same sort of thing, but it's a very, very different, very, very different approach. And I think something's been lost because the hybrid proceedings make it very stilted and awkward. So answering questions is hard sometimes. Members can speak over each other unless you have a very good chair. Dress is important, and the backgrounds are important. This is a member who, you see the top of his head, but nothing much more than that. And this member is walking around the room. The technique is always important. It's important to get your questions clear and crisp, so the whole atmosphere is very different. So I think the committees have changed less than the plenary, because much of their business has been online for years anyway. Their written evidence has been online and so forth. And the other thing which is important is that virtual hearings do have downsides. They're a bit artificial, but they are nevertheless quite, they open up. I work for the International Development Committee, and as long as we get the time right, we know that we can get evidence from people in Yemen. We get evidence from people all over Europe, from people in North America, and the concept of the world has actually seemed to get a bit smaller. So we can actually reach out to more people by using these online means. Unfortunately, though, in terms of the committee, the esprit de corps committees, we have a very strong committee system in the UK. Select committees are very cross-party, they're very bipartisan in their approach. And we have lost quite a lot of that because we can't meet together in the same room. And we can't, for instance, go on visits in the UK and elsewhere, which is great for improving the esprit de corps of these very important committees. So, as I think we heard that the government acted swiftly in various ways. To go into a bit more detail about how the government responded to coronavirus itself. This just shows you, rather like the slide you saw before about that Gavin said about the bill at the end of the Brexit process. On the 3rd of March 2020, the government published its coronavirus action plan. 16 days later, it published its emergency bill, and the bill was passed in 4 business days, less than 4 business days, and received royal assent. It became an act on the 25th of March. It had very considerable opportunities here for delegated legislation, for statutory instruments, which involve the work of ministers direct. And that meant that delegated legislation is no longer a backwater. The problem is that the system for delegated legislation scrutiny in the House of Commons was designed for quieter days. The committee I used to work on, which is called the Joint Committee for Statutory Instruments, meets every week, and it looks in a detailed way at certain implications of the delegated legislation that's been put forward. And this is fine when you're talking about relative unimportant things like fees for driving tests, or what sort of lamb meat can be put through the system. It's fine, but the policy implications of this delegated legislation are not generally looked at by the House of Commons. There is a committee in the House of Lords that looks at it, but that's an unelected body. That's a constitutional problem. And the difficulty also is that these are not a sort of ready, steady flow, regular flow of these not very important instruments. This was a load of important documentation, important legislation put through on the subjects of Brexit and COVID, hundreds at a time, or hundreds in a month, and we were overwhelmed by them at some point. We have some very, very clever lawyers on that committee that looked at it, but they were not policy experts. So they looked at the legal implications of the legislation. They looked at whether ministers were taking powers that they shouldn't have, like, as we say, becoming ultra vires. But this was on a very narrow legal basis, and the committee, the House of Commons, that looks at this has no chance really to look at these in much detail. The whole thing has to be done very quickly, and this is a problem. But I think there's a dilemma here. One is that the science is very important. Governments say all the time that they're following the science, but there's also law, and Gavin has described the problems with law and the fact that law does not always find good scrutiny when it has to be done very quickly, and it has to be done in a delegated way with ministers having much of the power. So ministers had to decide how to follow the science, how to do the law in a way which was fair and was scrutinised properly and worked in terms of being enforceable. And also we have to think about human nature. One of the problems is that human nature makes people, particularly I think in the West, makes people go along with laws or just obey laws, but only to a minimal extent. They will do what the law tells them, but they won't think round it in their behaviour. So in terms of COVID, people really didn't understand quite what the government was telling them much of the time. And there's still a problem in terms of the government communicating through delegated legislation. And the point is, how can you enforce it? And we'll see that as an issue a little bit in the next slide. So you've got this series of dilemmas for governments where you've got science calling for something, the law being applied in a particular way, and people going up to the limits of the law, even when it's very not safe for them to do so, and human nature playing a part. The other thing, and I don't mention it here, but the economy. And I think we mentioned that before, the balance between keeping people safe in a public health way and keeping the economy going as well. And there is a temptation for all governments to balance those things out in a way which tends to favour the economy. The pressures are always on to open up. And we've seen the last year or so in all countries pretty well, governments that open up possibly a little bit too much, allow too much contact, the disease gets a hold again, and you have to clamp down again. So you have a cat and mouse game between the disease and politicians. This is a big problem when you're trying to legislate. Here's an example. These were what's called SAGE. It's a very, very well-named organisation. The Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies said at one point last year, interaction in a home environment may pose greater risk than public and workplace settings due to familiarity with people and the location, and the lack of clear responsibility to ensure the environment is safe. People relax, but you can reduce the risks of social interactions through reducing the numbers of people involved and the size of their networks. Official advice that went to ministers. Ministers responded by doing this sort of thing. They tried to manage the risk. So this is a statutory instrument that went through my committee last year, saying that restrictions on participation in gatherings in private dwellings and other indoor settings in the northwest of England were to be these. The reason it was the northwest of England was that particular part of the country had very serious problems with COVID infections for much of last year, really serious problems. So the law said, and this is a statutory instrument, but this was legally enforceable, during the emergency period, which was for a month or so, no person may participate in a gathering in the protected area, that's northwest of England, which consists of 2 or more persons and takes place in a private dwelling. Incidentally, this is a picture of a famous comedy family in the northwest of England, Manchester, called the Royal family, R-O-Y-L-E family. And they, of course, could not gather for that period together in that convivial manner. So this is basically saying, in your home, you cannot meet another person or more than one other person. The problem is, I suppose, is that enforceable? How can you enforce something like that? It's a legal requirement. It really is A, very intrusive, and B, really not enforceable, and therefore not particularly good law. But given that the scientific advice was that you had to keep people separate in their homes, what else could you do? All this has led to this being called abracadabra lawmaking. This is pulling out of a hat, like a rabbit out of a hat, the diktat of this sort, and this has been highly criticised by a number of people. Professor Tom Hickman of London University saying this has been totally unsatisfactory and a total disregard for the House. He quotes the Speaker of saying that, that's the Speaker saying that, and he has called it abracadabra lawmaking. So legally, there are a lot of people who are against it. Very significant, well, an historian as well as a Supreme Court Judge, Jonathan Sumption. I believe that history will look back on the measures taken to contain it, the COVID, as a monument of collective hysteria and governmental folly. The degree of scrutiny provided for in the Public Health Act is limited, so very limited. It wasn't just the COVID Act that they used. A colleague of mine on the committee, actually, editor of Statute Law Review, Daniel Greenberg, criticised legislation by wishful thinking and governmental micromanagement of citizens' lives. So this is the idea that government hopes and wishes they can legislate people and to wish. And the problem is, can all this be enforced? Probably much of it cannot be. So there's political disquiet as well. It came from two sides of the political spectrum, all this delegated legislation. The Brexit SIs had already proliferated, leading to establishment of a new committee and a lot of suspicion from many parliamentarians, particularly those who had opposed Brexit, who were often Liberals and Labour supporters. On the other side, on the left, on the right, COVID-19 came along. There was a feeling that many of the laws put forward were intrusive and anti-business, i.e. they closed down restaurants and shops and bars, many with no debate and under emergency procedures, little scrutiny and immediate effect. And that was the big problem. And a lot of the right of the free market supporting right-wing conservatives were against that. So the whole problem was that this whole way of working and way of managing legislation gets attacked from the legal establishment and from both left and right in Parliament. So wrapping up, I suppose, for the whole of this session, there's a pessimistic view of the future. Democratic countries often not control the COVID-19 virus as well as less democratic ones. Choose your comparison, Europe or the USA versus, say, China. There are signs that even before COVID-19, people in the UK were distrustful of elected politicians and parliaments and prepared to go along with leaders who bypass both. For instance, there are particularly strong feelings in opinion polls in the UK about 2 years ago when Mrs May was the Prime Minister that Parliament needed to get out of the way so Brexit could happen, despite the number of complicated issues that Brexit brought up. And that, I think, worried a lot of people. There's a feeling that Parliament could be bypassed in any. And of course, the number of populist or authoritarian governments are increasing. A more optimistic view, which is that science and technical ability has come to the fore much more. There's been an unprecedented emphasis in peacetime on the capability of government, or not capability. The EU has been looked at very closely recently as well, and on its ability to explain to citizens what they need to do to keep themselves and the country safe. So experts are important now, and populism doesn't like experts, and experts have now become very, very important people. The chief medical officer in the UK has become a major public figure. He has some difficult things to do, but he has become very important, and scientists and medical people are now very much to the fore. And I think that's probably in a populist time that might be seen as rather a good thing. So role of facts in politics has become less important rather than feelings and rhetoric. Brexit has also now happened. I think this may not be quite right. So Remainer versus Leaver, which was one of the big issues, pro-Brexit, anti-Brexit forces. Now it's happened, and so the narrative is less important than the facts. On the other hand, as we're now finding about Northern Ireland, narrative is very important. So that's a more optimistic view about what this means for Parliament and the policy generally. So I'll now move on, I think, to my next slide, which is a question. Is that right? Yeah, there's a polling question, and I'll now let Denise take over.
Hello there. So I'm just now launching the poll. So again, I'd be grateful if you could show your votes here. We've had just one response so far. So please do. That's it. People are now voting, Philip. And Gavin's poll is still there as well if you haven't yet voted on that one. Responses to your poll first.
Hello, Denise. Do you want me to answer on my poll?
Yeah, let me show the responses. There we go. Can you see that, Gavin?
No, but if I click, yes, I can see it now.
Excellent.
Yes, on rather a low turnout, I have to say, but nearly 3/4 of those who've responded think that the control of the executive over legislation and public policy has been increased by COVID. That would probably get a similar result if we had a UK exclusive response to a similar question. As I say, it's a low turnout, and the statistical validity of such things is limited, but it does appear that COVID has given government a lot of plenary powers, which have enabled it and encouraged it, and indeed required it to move quickly and with less reference to Parliament. So thank you for your responses to that. Back to you, Denise, if you...
Sorry, I had silenced my mic. Okay, so I've just shown the results to Philip's poll. Can everybody see those results now?
Yes, I can see them.
I can see them.
Okay, Philip?
Yeah, that's, I think, not, obviously there's very much a split vote there, isn't there? I mean, some people feel their country's legislatures have adapted properly or well or effectively, but lots don't feel they've adapted effectively. Whether that means that people are saying that the COVID has meant that the legislatures have become weaker, that they have become less able to scrutinise and hold governments to account, or whether it's simply a matter of practically failing to do it. That's an important element of it. There are difficulties always in responding to a situation in which people no longer have a single building to go to, and not everyone's together. People are spread all over the place. So I think it's probably a mixture of the effectiveness in terms of effectiveness against ministries and keeping them under monitoring and accountability, or on the other side would be where you have a situation of I practically find that procedures are not able to be carried out. That you cannot, as an MP or as a member of the public, you can't engage with parliaments in the way that you want to. So it's a mixture of the two, but it shows that there are questions over whether legislatures are doing a good job at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, so it doesn't look like we've had any questions posted yet in the questions tab. So please, if you have any questions, put them in there quickly now. But I did have a message come through, so perhaps the question box isn't working. So here's question number 1. As the UK doesn't have a codified constitution, it seems strange that the courts can rule the government's decisions to be unconstitutional. Can you explain this, please?
Shall I have a go at answering that one?
That would be lovely. Thank you, Gavin.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and probably requires half a day at least to deal with it properly. if you go back in history a few decades, the courts were not really were very timid about framing litigation in constitutional terms. But gradually, and I think the setting up of a UK Supreme Court had at least a psychological effect on judicial behaviour in this respect. That was in 2009. The courts have gradually begun to flex their muscles a little bit and identify some areas of activity, of government activity, and indeed even legislation as being a bit different and a bit special, and engaging fundamental constitutional principles. Some people are a little nervous about this. They think that the judges might be going a little bit into territory that isn't any of their business. But I think the consensus among the legal profession, certainly, and it's shared by quite a few politicians, is fair enough. You know, that although we don't have a formal constitution, there are some visible or semi-visible red lines beyond which governments shouldn't go. And the Supreme Court has been developing principles. Of course, we're a common law country that is accustomed to judges building up bodies of law through precedent. The Supreme Court has been building up some constitutional principles that are very interesting and have been particularly interesting in a Brexit context.
Okay, thank you, Gavin. I have now a question from Theodora, and she has asked, how about the proportionality principle regarding the COVID-19 legislative measures taken? You feel that it was applied satisfactorily? Question mark.
I can have a go at that, and then maybe Gavin could add something as well. The proportionality principle. I think the question in a sense is that principles are developed in common law by judges, and to a certain extent, always by statute. If you're asking were they proportional, I think they would be difficult to claim that each individual piece of legislation, particularly the legislation to do with COVID and the statutory instruments that related to it that I was dealing with, that they were proportional in themselves, simply because they were often by the end of 3 or 4 weeks, as the situation might improve in an area, they may become way out of proportion. The question, though, is, were they proportional to the requirements of keeping public health in view? And the great thing there was that the scientific advice was something that certainly for the first 6 months or so, the government in the UK followed very closely. So they said, we are following the science. The scientific advice is that we need to cut down on contact in homes or whatever. And then they translated that quite quickly, very often, into the statutory legislation, the bits of statutory instruments. The problem there is that they tried to get the proportionality principle in place by only applying them to different parts of the country. And this was they're called tiers, or the different bands and so forth. So, for instance, Leicester, which is a large city in the middle of the country, had a lot of very harsh measures applied to it in the summer, when the rest of us were unable to go on with our normal business largely. But very soon, it became rather difficult to explain that was proportionate, because very soon other parts of the country began to be infected as well. And there suddenly had to be an increase in the size of those areas covered. So without being too legalistic about it, it is simply a matter of trying to be proportional by applying the law only in areas where there was a serious problem. But unfortunately, as Gavin pointed out, this infection does not go along with the proportionality principle. It rushes very quickly from one part of the country to another. So when the government tried to apply the principle in a way to only parts of the country that needed it, then that didn't work. It didn't work in practical terms because very soon other parts of the country would be infected. The other thing that happened was it was felt to be unfair. So people in Leicester, people in certain parts of Manchester or Liverpool felt that it was unfair to have harsh restrictions applied to their lives, their shopping and their going out to restaurants, when other parts of the country didn't have it. And I think the proportionality principle, they tried to apply it, but it didn't really work in a practical sense. But Gavin may have some more views on that.
Well, only very briefly that I entirely agree with what Philip has said. I spoke just now about the courts and the increased willingness of judges to recognise there are some red lines beyond which governments shouldn't go. And I suppose one could envisage situations in which people were being locked up without trial for breaching minor COVID regulations. And the issue of proportionality might well be raised in litigation there. But I think on the big picture of governments taking urgent action to deal with an emergency that is very much the province of government, I think the courts would be extremely nervous of substituting their judgment about what is proportional and what isn't, other than in the most outrageously egregious circumstances. I may be wrong. Maybe there will be litigation along those lines in due course. But at the moment, I think the courts are sort of waiting in the sidelines, but recognizing that there is a province into which it'd be unwise for them to go.
Okay, I have now a question from Dennis from the Parliament of Kenya, and he's asking, does the UK Supreme Court have mandate to declare an act duly enacted by the UK Parliament as unconstitutional?
That's one for Gavin.
Yes, and it casts me back to an age which is now beginning to fade, when we were members of the European Union. And in the context, although we haven't got a constitution, we were in those days bound by the treaties of the European Union. And the courts did develop a jurisprudence whereby domestic legislation, UK legislation that was incompatible with treaty obligations, could be disapplied, I think was the expression, on quasi-constitutional grounds. I think it would be pretty difficult now for the courts to strike down primary legislation that had been passed through Parliament using the usual procedures, even legislation that was passed in a great hurry, as with some of the legislation we were talking about earlier. It would be very difficult for the courts to be persuaded that primary legislation was unconstitutional. Secondary legislation, it's another matter altogether, really, because secondary legislation has to be in conformity with the parent act, with the primary legislation from which it's derived. And there have been quite a few historical instances over the years of secondary legislation not being deemed unconstitutional, but being deemed ultra vires, beyond the powers. But primary legislation, I can't see much of a future for striking down primary legislation. Certainly now we're outside the European Union.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There is judicial review. That's available, whereby if a public body has not gone along with the proper processes in making a decision, It can be reviewed by the courts, and things can be struck down. But that is purely a matter of process. And if the process is correctly carried out, even quite bad decisions are not struck down by the court. So judicial review is only used in quite limited cases. I've been involved in quite a few myself, and it is very obvious that it is to do with the mechanics of decision taking rather than the quality of decision taking, and there is no broader constitutional principle involved in that. So judicial review is fairly limited. It sounds as if it's a big scope thing, but it doesn't actually get used in that way. And a lot of applications for judicial review are turned down before they get to court.
Hello there. So I have one more question from Theodora from Cyprus, and she's asking, how can we resist to populism in times of crisis when everything develops speedily with no time given to actually think, assess and analyse?
Well, I can kick off. I think the more sort of positive view about that is that because we have in many countries now anyway a much greater impact of experts and of science and of hard fact. But I think it's more difficult to, in the same sense, it might be more difficult long term for populists to succeed. The other thing is that I suppose it might be said about populists that they are very good at gaining power, but are not necessarily that good at exercising it. And this is particularly true when it comes to handling things like infectious diseases, where, as you say, the speed is very important to get a grip, but you have to have the population keep a very close eye on the performance of government. And if you don't get the infections down, you will get a lot of trouble. So I think populists in general are not that good at governing. There may be some examples of ones that are, I don't know. But those who just seek to, as it were, to raise tensions in a country don't succeed quite as well when the country needs to pull together to defeat and combat disease. Particularly important is that people obey the good principles of keeping public health. I think certainly in Britain and a lot of other countries, people have not generally gone beyond the requirements of sensible public health activity. So they are pulling together, and the populist looks to divide societies. And I think in many respects, although not in all, COVID has brought people together.
Okay, finally, I just have one more question. I think we've just got time to answer that one. The question is, has the pandemic permanently raised the status and credibility of scientists and other experts, or has it undermined them by dragging them into politics? It's a nice question.
Does Gavin want to have a go?
No, you have a go first, Philip,
Okay.
and I'll follow in your wake.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because the outcome of this won't be known for some time in a way. There will be inquiries, I think, in a lot of countries as to what's happened and how things have been done, and each country really has a different sort of structure of scientific advice giving, and medical people have different impacts in different countries. The UK experience, I think, has been that there are stresses and strains between the more cautious views of scientists and medical people and the less cautious views of some people in various parties. And the business community that wants to open up, because they're losing a lot of money as the lockdowns continue. So there will be stresses and strains which will come onto the political scene from time to time. But I think in general, the credibility of scientists and medical people has increased over time. I haven't seen the polls for the UK, but I think that in general, some of the most credible people in the country are now our chief medical people, and they have done well out of it. Interesting question. Sometimes you see the chief medical officer in the UK on the same platform as the Prime Minister, and they're answering questions together, which I think can be a bit difficult for each, particularly for the scientific people, medical people. Sometimes they give their own briefings, which I think probably would be a better way of doing it. Would mean that they would be guaranteed not to get dragged so much into the political sphere. But generally, our medical people and scientific people have done very well in this country anyway. And of course, they've become very famous, like Dr. Fauci in the United States, for holding a particularly strong and determined line on that.
Yeah, I would add to that only that COVID is such a horrendous and uniquely catastrophic scenario that politicians have had no choice but to defer to a substantial extent to scientific opinion. In quieter times and in other contexts, politics becomes the dominant force in political life. At the moment, politics has to make some compromises. And if it's seen not to be making compromises and seeking to proceed without reference to science, where huge numbers of lives are being lost and the economy is being devastated, then that is political suicide. But in other contexts, politicians being politicians will probably cherry pick the scientific advice that they listen to, and they will get away with it.
I think vaccines is an example of where politics is beginning to creep into the COVID story.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we've finished there with the questions. So, Claire, it's over to you now to close our webinar.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you. And Gavin, Philip, thank you both very much. I hope you can hear me again. Hello?
Yes, you can, Claire.
Yeah. Good. Oh, my camera's gone off. Well, thanks. That was terrific, Gavin and Philip. Really, really good. Looking at so many aspects, really, of Parliament, and highly topical, of course. So thank you all so much for joining us as well. And what good questions too from colleagues who are active in the questions and the chat box. And also thank you for taking part in the polls. I think some people may have had a bit of difficulty in voting, so apologies for that, but at least we got a flavour of your opinions. So you can see, I hope, ahead of you a slide with some of the things that we've got coming up. I'll mention again the Parliamentary Administration Workshop, which Gavin and Philip both make very significant contributions to. We hope very much, fingers crossed, that we'll be able to run it here in London in October, providing travel arrangements and protection, health protection is much improved by then. I'm sure we all very much hope so. We will be doing some more free webinars, so we'll keep you informed about those. Do join if you have time. And for our workshops as well, we have quite a large range, as you may know. We're certainly glad, and you're very welcome to join remotely, virtually, like this, if you are not able to join us in person. But we do hope you'll be able to join us in person, and you'd all be very welcome. So just once again, thank you, Gavin, Philip, Denise, thank you very much for steering us through, and thank you all for joining us. Hope to see you again, and please keep safe and well. Thank you. Bye-bye for now.
Bye.
Goodbye all.